Zero RB watch time. We're going to look through some of the players to keep a close eye on ahead of NFL Week 8. Shawn, it is going to be an exciting week. I'm pretty pumped for Week 8 of the NFL action. There's some interesting matchups, and we're going to talk through some of those scenarios. But mainly today, looking at the backfields and how things have played out over the last couple of weeks and what that means moving forward. Shawn, NFL Week 8. I didn't do this for a while. I used to start off week 1, week 2. I can't believe we're this close to the season, how the season is going. But it is hard to believe that we are at week 8 of the season. It has, those opening 2 months have really flown by.
Well, I mean, they've flown by / seemed like they took an eternity with some of the injured players. Injuries always a big part. You're just hoping that it doesn't hit your own particular rosters especially hard. But there have been so many fun things as well. One of the reasons that we're talking zero RB watch today, Colm, a bunch of those guys have hit. Obviously, waivers is over for this week. We're looking more big picture. We're trying to figure out, as we move through this weekend into the next, what are some sort of look ahead types of waiver additions? Who are some stash candidates? How do we expect the NFL to evolve at the running back position, especially in maybe high leverage or complicated, controversial backfields right now, where if you play it correctly or create exposure to the right scenarios, then perhaps this could blow up for you in the future, make a difference down the line. So this isn't so much about week 8 as it is winning the rest of the season and just trying to understand how some of these backfields are evolving. That's a big part of staying ahead of the curve and at least giving yourself some chances. You're not going to be right on everything. Not all the players on the zero RB initial candidates countdown are hits, but you have to create the right exposure to the right balance of candidates to have some of those guys who do come through. And then when we were joking earlier this week that Michael Hitchcock and I had played 3 of our zero RB candidates, including in the flex on a team that blew up for easily my highest score of the season and one of the highest scores I've had in the FFPC in the last 3 or 4 years. Colm, we're going to try and figure out how listeners can do that in week 10, week 12, week 14, and maybe then have the right roster for the shootout. You get that FPC team in, you get that main event team in. You're looking at $1 million, $500,000, and beyond that, if you're playing in a medium-sized home league with your coworkers or your college buddies, I mean, that's the league you have to win. So we're going to figure out how to win
those leagues
are
today. Priceless. You mentioned $1 million, but the home leagues, Shawn, they are still the priceless leagues where sometimes it means the most to try and to win those ones. So we are going to talk through those, Shawn. We aren't going to talk about the big news that happened on Thursday. Well, relatively big news is that Kadarius Toney has been traded from the Giants to the Chiefs, but you and Ben already talked about that on Stealing Bananas. So I would urge anyone who is looking to dissect that to head on over and listen to Stealing Bananas after we finish up today's show. But Shawn, the interesting one here I want to kick out with, we have a list here of the teams to talk about, but San Francisco are in there, and obviously we have Christian McCaffrey, who has been now traded to the 49ers. What's your thoughts on that backfield in terms of from a zero RB watch? And a lot of people will have had the likes of Jeff Wilson, who would have been obviously going in the real right direction, but now Christian McCaffrey's there, and then there is other reserve running backs who we were keeping an eye on behind that in San Francisco. What are your thoughts rest of season, and is there a chance for one of those other guys to have a significant impact outside of an unfortunate injury, for example, to Christian McCaffrey?
Well, this is such an interesting backfield and one that can create a lot of value. You've got to keep your eye on it even after McCaffrey is added. We know that he hasn't been very healthy the last several seasons. So the backups there still retain a lot of interest. And I think that the big development here in week 7 that, kind of goes off the radar to an extent because Christian McCaffrey is there is simply that Tyrion Davis-Price actually plays a pretty decent amount. You get 26 snaps for Wilson, 13 for TDP. He's someone who in shallow dynasty leagues, hard to keep, even though he's an intriguing young player. Obviously, they spent that 3rd round pick on him. I think that once they spend all the rest of those picks to acquire McCaffrey, then every other player feels irrelevant. And yet that draft pick there still sort of reared its ugly head, if you want to say, but still was relevant this past week where he gets a target. He has 2 rushing attempts if you are playing Jeff Wilson, when he has 8 opportunities, those 3 that you lose to Tyrion Davis-Price, you're like, we need everything we can get here. The other thing is that eventually Elijah Mitchell will come back and probably be the clear-cut backup. I actually have some teams where he was stashed on a McCaffrey team, and suddenly, as opposed to being someone who maybe could be a second half league winner or at least league impactor, now he's a handcuff, so you keep him then probably as the handcuff. It is trickier for Wilson teams. Zachary Kruger and I have one of those never too early best ball tournament teams in the FFPC where we were getting a lot of points from Wilson and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Again, this team drafted very, very early. Those guys not necessarily targets at certain points in the season, but you benefit when you get lucky. And that team is way out in front, but now has really quite a few questions at the running back position. The Kansas City Chiefs, another one that is at least mildly controversial, or at least provocative as we head into week 8. But I think that Tyrion Davis-Price playing in this game is something you do have to keep in the back of your mind. It's more relevant than maybe it seems on the surface.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be an interesting one to track. The other one, Shawn, that you have in here is Carolina. Obviously, there was quite a bit of fab budget spent across all formats of leagues for these running backs, linked obviously with Christian McCaffrey moving team. Then we have Foreman and Chuba Hubbard, who get a substantial amount of work split between them this past week in terms of how things worked out. It was very balanced in terms of the snap share was 54-46. The targets was 2-3. Attempts though was where the gap I think really was, with Foreman leading the way there 15-9, but nothing massive in terms of the team opportunities. 35% to Foreman, Hubbard getting 25% of the total team opportunities, but pretty balanced in that backfield. But this was a team that a couple of weeks ago couldn't put any points on the board. They looked pretty good overall against Tampa Bay this past week. So what is the value and moving forward with both of these guys? Is it a case of if you've picked them up this week, you're adding them to your lineup and hoping for the best, or is there one of them that you have as a clear priority here to have moving forward?
Well, they claimed that Hubbard could have gone back into the game last week if they had needed him to. It's funny that they were in position to rest against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And yet he has missed a number of practices this week as we record at this juncture. So it looks like Hubbard may actually miss or be pretty limited this week. You look at the expected points numbers in their week 7 upset, and those are pretty interesting. 9.9 for Foreman, 8.9 for Hubbard. Both of them outperformed by the value of essentially a touchdown, 6.6 and 6.4. We know that Foreman broke the long run. Hubbard broke the medium length touchdown. They both looked very good. And this one, you head over to the Advanced Stat Explorer, and you can see that Foreman had a 15% broken tackle percentage. Obviously, it's much easier to do that in a single game than over the course of a season. Those would be elite numbers if you were to do that over the long term. Again, just one game, but you have the 3.5 yards after contact. You've got good before contact numbers for both of these backs. Again, a little bit of a surprise when you consider who they are, who they were playing against. It does illuminate some of the other struggles that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are also having right now. The thing here for this week is that it doesn't seem impossible by any stretch that Foreman could jump up to EP numbers in the 15 range. It's probably more likely still within the context of the Carolina offense that he underperforms as opposed to overperforms. But this is a guy who, is big and fast. And those two things will help you at the NFL level. He appears to have gotten over all of the little things that were holding him back as a young player. He came into the NFL with very good projections. Kevin Cole was writing for us at the time. And I think Foreman popped ahead of some other big names in his model. Obviously, those things continue to be improved on as we go through time. I'm not saying Foreman would be the number one player in his model right now, even looking back on that season, but it gives you a sense of where Foreman could be or how he could be viewed differently if not for some of those struggles. Now, those struggles happen. We have to consider them, but I think that Foreman and Hubbard were very interesting players last week. I had Hubbard in quite a few lineups, and so you're excited when you see that highlight flash up on the screen. You're excited when you go back and watch the game. This is actually the last game I watched this week, and even knowing the outcome, I was impressed by some of the elements there with DJ Moore. Obviously, PJ Walker opens it up a little bit this past week. But Foreman, Hubbard, both of those guys looked good and flashed the talent that we think they have. Hubbard is a guy where I think that he is a long-term hold at the very least, but buy in Dynasty, again, not someone you're going to overpay for. You're going to pay for this one particular game. It may not even be this season, but when you're talking about adding guys to the very back of your Dynasty roster, Hubbard is someone we shouldn't forget about just because he had a rough rookie season. And the struggles that they had this year, just how bad they were, their coach getting fired, all of those things. I mean, those dynamics were in place after McCaffrey was injured a season ago.
Yeah.
I'm still pretty optimistic about him, even though obviously you were disappointed that he didn't do more when he was filling in for CMC last year.
Yeah, and when we look at, you mentioned Foreman. Last year when Derrick Henry was injured, he looked tremendous in that Tennessee offense as well. So I think they're going to be an interesting combination to watch moving forward. And you mentioned the injury status. We'll watch that for week 8 coming up. But people might wonder again, like we do quite a bit, Shawn. You mentioned Blair's article on the website. Anything Blair does is fantastic, but each week he does the 0 RB watch, and Shawn follows it up with more kind of a conversational piece around the running back options. And you're kind of getting a sneak preview of it here today as we talk through some of these players. But the reason that it is so important is you continue to look through these teams and see how those backfields change. If we look back to last year, and unfortunately he is injured for the remainder of this season, Rachaad Penny. At this point last year, Rachaad Penny had played he had rushed a total of 8 times. In week 1 last season, rushed 2 times, was inactive or did not play all the way through to NFL week 7, had 6 rushing attempts week 7, week 8 has 7 rushing attempts, does not play week 9, 2 rushing attempts in week 10, does not play in week 11. Moving forward, he plays the rest of the season from week 12, but it's really week 13 onwards where the domination starts, with 137 yards in week 13, 135 yards week 16, 170 yards week 16, or week 15, and then week 16, and then week 17, 190 yards, and a lot of touchdowns sprinkled in there. All 6 of his touchdowns coming in that 5-game stretch. So you're looking for these guys who really charge that roster up to the fantasy championship, I guess, at the end of the day. So this is why we put so much time into looking at these guys and what we're looking at moving forward. Shawn, the next one up is Green Bay, and this has been an offense, we've talked about it, it has struggled. There's been a lot of situations where it hasn't been all that exciting. Talked last week about, they just need to get Aaron Jones the ball more. They need to get him the ball as much as possible. He is a dynamic playmaker, looked fantastic last week, but they did give them the ball a lot more last week versus what had been happening previously. The downside of that is for AJ Dillon drafters, he is somebody who may now become somebody who's on the 0 RB watch, because I think that there's going to be a point that if this isn't a good week for him this week, people will be starting to drop him in those shallower bench leagues, and then we'll be getting into the bye week scenario. You might have to cut somebody like a Dillon if it continues like that. So last week, we have, in terms of the snap share, it's 74-30 in terms of in favor of Aaron Jones. We get 10 targets for Aaron Jones. That's a 30% target share for the team. In terms of rush attempts, there is only 12 rush attempts, but 8 of those going to Aaron Jones, 4 of them going to AJ Dillon. So that leaves, in terms of the opportunities, 18 to Aaron Jones and 4 to AJ Dillon. Now, the game scenario last week, I have listened to Aaron Rodgers this week talking about it in terms of a lot of 3rd and 12 or 2nd and 12s, 2nd and 10 situations. So they did not run the ball last week. We joked on the recap show of the teams that ran it 40 plus times last week. Well, the Packers only ran it on those 12 occasions. But Shawn, how are you feeling about AJ Dillon moving forward? We touched on our concerns with the Packers where they were being drafted. Aaron Jones looked good last week. I don't think we're getting them 10 targets every week, but I do think 18 opportunities is in the realm of possibility for him. But just the 4 for AJ Dillon is a concern there.
Yeah, you look at the first month of the season, and everybody who drafted Dillon really early, I think, had to be mildly encouraged, because he actually has 6 more opportunities than Aaron Jones in that first month. Almost hold his own in targets. He has 9 more rushing attempts. He only trails in snaps by 16, and they're on the field together quite a bit. Then you go to the last 3 weeks, and suddenly he's trailing in opportunities by a very wide margin, losing out on both targets and attempts, 21 fewer ops overall. And now we have gotten to a point where there's a big split in snaps as well. 127 for Jones, only 72 for A.J. Dillon. This could be a situation where we just jump back to more balance again in week 8, because we're now in this pattern where week 5, heavy Aaron Jones, week 6 bounces back in favor of Dillon, week 7, heavy Aaron Jones, could bounce back again. But I think it's more likely that we're moving in a direction now where Aaron Jones is just going to be the very clear 1A and maybe simply the clear A. And A.J. Dillon is filling a more niche role behind him. Game script is going to come into that. Maybe they're still looking at Dillon in some of these short yardage elements. There has been some rhetoric suggesting that they want him to run a little bit harder. That's never good to hear, especially when the Packers are dealing with these other issues as well, right? Everybody who is not dominating, this week or the last 2 weeks is starting to get thrown under the bus. That dynamic with the Packers makes you worry that, not exactly panic, but there are going to be some people who get hung out to dry here and do have their roles changed. The other part of this is that the Packers have just not been nearly as good as we expected. And so you look at some of these teams where there were 2 guys drafted relatively early. You have Tony Pollard drafted just right on the heels of Ezekiel Elliott and drafted as though, you really needed that injury that has happened now. And the path that week 8 probably will provide for Pollard for that to work out. You had Stevenson and Harris drafted relatively early there together, with Stevenson jumping ahead of him. That part has also worked out very nicely. Stevenson, a huge talent. Harris, probably an underrated talent. The rushing game specifically for the Patriots has been more effective than people anticipated. Still questions, obviously, now with the passing game, where the quarterback controversy is in full swing. It looks like it'll be Mac Jones for this week. But the Packers were just an extreme version of that, where coming off of those 2 MVP seasons, coming off of those 2 really high seeds in the NFC, and then losing all the wide receivers, the idea is that these guys are going to be very, very involved in the receiving game. That has come to fruition in some games, but not consistently enough to really boost either of these players. So now both Jones and Dillon are really needing to see an injury to the other guy to be able to come anywhere close to draft position. But maybe Jones can do it without, if he continues to demonstrate the explosiveness that we've seen season after season after season from him. He's a guy where every year we say his expected points numbers are not going to be in the range that they need to be to justify this draft position. But if he scores a lot of these touchdowns from 20 yards out, if he steals some of the receiving touchdowns in close, then based on that within the offense, he can get right there to do it. And especially then if you have the big games timed correctly. He's still a guy where he can underperform during the season and then win you a tournament if he hits on those big games, weeks 15, 16, 17, maybe 2 out of 3, something like that. It's still tricky here because the main thing that you need to see is the Packers offense play better. I do have a pretty decent amount of Dillon in Dynasty. I got some offers from him from teams that are more looking to 2023. And obviously the Packers could bounce back. I went ahead and accepted those offers this week. I think that's the way to play Dillon in the short term. And
just out of interest, Shawn, what sort of value are you getting in case people are looking to 2023? What should they be throwing out there for a Dillon?
Well, I traded him for DeAndre Hopkins. I don't know that that necessarily is going to be something that is available all that often. Although, again, Dillon did go ahead of Hopkins this year. Now, part of that was that you had to wait those first 6 weeks. In the Underdog Resurrection drafts that Ben and I did together, Hopkins was going much earlier, and then the other big change is that Marquise Brown is out at least for a while. Brown may come back and knock down the volume opportunities in the fantasy playoffs, but especially if someone is looking to the future and is trying to move some of these guys. One of the things you have to remember is that this is the perfect time to also sell DeAndre Hopkins. He's coming back. He had a huge game right away. It could have easily not happened exactly like that. And then your trade value is much lower because there are questions about, well, what will Hopkins be? And when you have a window to move a veteran, even a veteran wide receiver of Hopkins' pedigree, you want to go ahead and take those, because even if the players end up actually playing well for 3 or 4 more years, if you're not in position to compete at those points, I mean, what do? You're going to have to sell low at some point. A.J. Dillon still a big talent. I mean, my concern with him would be just that as you get into even your mid-20s at running back, it's hard to move the player. So I like doing that. There were a few other peripheral pieces in that trade that also were better for the person on the other side, a little bit to balance out Hopkins. It's the general value there. But I think if you have Hopkins and you have a team that is not competitive this year, trying to make some moves for Hopkins and some other leagues as well, big picture, we almost always recommend going in the other direction. That's part of the perpetual reloading. But if you've built this really strong base of young players, as long as you don't overpay, then there are going to be some specific time periods where adding a veteran doesn't hurt you, may help you get across. This hasn't been a good year for young players. And so if you have a championship type of team, this might be one of those unique circumstances where adding a little bit of a veteran punch makes sense. Anybody who's looking for that a little bit more in redraft, Ben and I talked about receivers you might target in that vein in our most recent episode of Stealing Bananas. Talked about some guys we don't usually talk about.
Love that. Shawn's getting every so often. Shawn's throwing in these segues to give plugs to the other shows and linking them all together. Love to see that growth, Shawn, as we continue through our podcast. I like to think of it as like a podcast multiverse between all the different shows here on RotoViz Radio. The next one, Shawn, you mentioned it's about the rest of the season rather than just week 8, but just week 8 represents a big opportunity for somebody who you touched on a moment ago. That is Tony Pollard. Ezekiel Elliott out this week. Pollard should get a huge amount of the backfield split in general. And this is kind of what people who drafted Pollard have been waiting for all along. There has been weeks where we've seen him flash, but they have kind of stuck with Elliott in a lot of the situations as well. So this could be where Pollard, puts up such a performance that they have to start to let him gain an edge in this backfield.
Yeah, I'm Pollard, one of these guys who a really impressive talent, and an impressive talent in terms of generating those after contact yards that people are so enthusiastic for, and doing it over a multiple year time frame, even though he's not a big back. Averages 3 yards after contact in 2020, averages 3 yards after contact in 2021, and in the first half of 2022 has taken it up a notch at 4.3 there. He has a 25% evasion rate. Those are Javonte Williams 2021 types of numbers. At this point, and especially with the Cowboys offense not being the juggernaut we expected, I mean, having that dynamism as a runner is important. I mean, Elliot kind of fitting into that Leonard Fournette category where when things go well and when he's delivered to the goal line, I mean, he's going to get some of those scores. And so we see that from him again this week. He does get, as Blair mentions in his article, back to 0. So back to break it even in terms of fantasy points over expectation. But he does have the MCL sprain in his right knee. Almost certainly misses week 8. There's a possibility that if they get in a pretty good position here, that they could take the long view, maybe try and get him all the way rested up. He's going to want to play. They can kind of couch this as, we really need him healthy for the stretch run and the reality playoffs. And the reality may be that they kind of want to have Pollard play as much as they can in the interim. In this week's game, Elliott gets to just a fraction under 16 points in terms of EP. That 16 range would make him, a more justifiable pick in that round 4 range for fantasy. He hasn't been there most of the year. Tony Pollard at 11.5 in this game. Elliott is at 11.1 for his full season average. If you stack most of that on, and we know that it's not going to be a situation where Elliott goes out and every single one of his touches in the way that he's used will go to Pollard. Some of it probably just disappears into the ether and they pass a little bit more. Some of it will go to the depth options in the Cowboy backfield. But you can add 75% of that on to Pollard and get him into that 20-ish range. Now it's going to probably sit much closer to 17, for example. But then Tony Pollard, with his chance to break a big play to outperform his expected point numbers, he's going to be a game breaker. He's going to be a week determiner in this matchup. If you have Pollard, I mean, this is the situation you have been pointing toward, salivating for. Yeah, I mean, this is exciting.
Yeah, so let's see what happens. But yeah, I have a couple of those. We've talked about Pollard for a long time, and it feels like this season is the time for that breakout to happen. But the Cowboys are trying their best for it not to come to fruition. But hopefully we see Pollard have a big week in NFL Week 8, and we can see how it plays out then down the stretch. Shawn, you mentioned earlier as well the Tampa Bay Buccaneers being in a bad situation last week, and it's such a situation that the Panthers are not really rushing to take players back onto the field that maybe are available at that point in time. But Rachaad White, Leonard Fournette, that backfield did not get much work last week in terms of total attempts, opportunities. We have Leonard Fournette with 11, only the 8 for Rachaad White, but a combined 19 attempts is not what we would expect opportunities is not what we would expect to see for them on a weekly basis. I've been impressed with White over the last couple of weeks, and I've been impressed with Fournette all season, but this isn't the normal plan that we're going to see with this team, to have a combined 69 snaps for them and just the 19 opportunities. So what's your outlook, though, as we move forward in terms of, is White encroaching into the overall piece of the pie with Leonard Fournette? And obviously we would expect much more what we've seen the previous 7 weeks versus what we've seen in week 8 from this backfield moving forward.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes and no. When you look at the line here, you kind of are thinking that once the game completely got out of hand at the end, the Buccaneers gave White some touches at that point. That's not actually the case. He was involved early, and that has been a theme for them for several weeks now, where once they finally decided, and you can kind of hear how that all developed when you listen to the question and answer with some of their beat reporters over this last month, that they're trying to force themselves to use White some. Anytime that you're saying we're trying to force ourselves to get somebody else in and give Fournette a little bit of a break, especially when Fournette is playing extremely poorly, I mean, that doesn't speak that favorably for White. And then, he's not grabbed the opportunity, right? Less than 3 yards per carry. No surprise that in that environment, both the before contact and the after contact numbers are terrible. You can't be averaging 2.7 yards per attempt and have good peripherals. He is actually forcing missed tackles on 8%. That's a solid number, but we're not seeing it manifest in actual yardage. So the big play hasn't been there yet. We know that one of the things that White brings to the table is that long speed. He's not one of these players who in the early going has looked comfortable at the NFL level, who has looked explosive. I think we'll get more from him in the second half, but it is a missed opportunity because Leonard Fournette has been bad. His 11% evasion rate is not good. His numbers in terms of both before and after contact are terrible. He has a game here where he goes 4 points under expectation from a fantasy perspective. You look at the game itself, and it really turns when he is stuffed on a key drive in the second half on 3rd and 1. They decide to go for it when a field goal would have at least gotten them some points on the board, broken into the scoring category there. They give him the ball again on 4th and 1. He gets out toward the edge, and his lack of speed and his lack of ability to hit and push forward, both very clearly on display as he is tackled for no gain. They turn the ball over on downs. They're never really in the game from that point. There's opportunity here, but neither of these backs really seizing it. We talk about how these backfields, and when you look at the guys who are the targets on the 0 RB candidates list, that it is in situations where during the season, things are going to move in the direction of the younger player, the more explosive player, but that player has to seize the day, right? It's not just something that happens on its own, and especially in this situation with Leonard Fournette, where he has the multi-year contract. I mean, it's easy to think, okay, well, Tom Brady is on his last legs. I mean, he looks done. There have been whispers that he might somehow walk away in season. That part I wouldn't think would happen. but you have the coaching change this year. You have 2023 looking like there could be a ton of upheaval. But even within that, the fact that Fournette has the contract for next year, I mean, they're not just going to go away from him. And they're not going to quit on this year. And so from that perspective, I think there are some disappointing things. It's a pretty stark contrast to the situation in Arizona, where James Conner, again, contractually, I mean, neither of these teams has paid to the extent that the Cowboys paid and locked Elliot into this role ahead of Pollard that's been so frustrating for years. But it is a case where, I mean, that backup, Eno Benjamin, for example, has to continue to dominate to hold any type of role when the team has put their money in a certain situation and thinks that the veteran probably gives them that balance. I mean, you look at Conner, you look at Fournette, neither one of these guys have any explosiveness whatsoever, but there's value to being a big back who can catch passes, because then your team can call whatever play they want, and you have a little bit of that short yardage success, even though in this last game for the Buccaneers, Fournette failed in that category.
Last team to talk about today, Shawn, is the Kansas City Chiefs. This in week 7 was kind of the definition of a three-man backfield between Pacheco, Edwards-Helaire, and Jerick McKinnon. McKinnon led the way in snaps, 44% of the team snaps. We get 30% for Pacheco, 27% for Edwards-Helaire. Pretty split then across, eight opportunities for Pacheco, 7 for Edwards-Helaire, the 5 for McKinnon. So this is one that I'm interested for you to dissect moving forward. Who is leading the way? The reports obviously come out ahead of last week that the team had given Pacheco the majority of the first team snaps in training throughout the week, but it didn't really go the way of him being the lead man in this backfield on the Sunday of the game.
Yeah, and that's because he's not really a good fit for what they need to do situationally. And so if he's going to be the nominal starter, then I mean, you've got some real they could create a dynamic here similar to what the Bills had in 2021 until they finally committed to Singletary down the stretch, where you have one of the most explosive offenses in football, an offense that you're saying, okay, they're going to deliver these guys to the goal line over and over and over, and yet we're not going to get the points. Now, one of the things that happened this last week is that Edwards-Helaire scored again, despite barely playing, and that keeps it moving a little bit for him. And when you have that first-round draft pick in your background, when you've scored these touchdowns, when you play for the Kansas City Chiefs, you're going to have some trade value in all formats, but it's as close to zero as it can possibly be for those things being true, right? Pacheco also has the issue here of not having looked good in short yardage and not really being a receiving back. He gets 0 targets in week 7. And so when you hear all of these notes about Pacheco has gone to number 1 and he's pushed Edwards-Helaire out, the first thing that you think is, well, in reality, what's going to happen once you get into the game is that Jerick McKinnon is going to lead the backfield in snaps, which is exactly what happened, because McKinnon can play both of these roles. He gets the 3 targets. He only gets the 2 attempts in sort of a strange but not completely unexpected deviation. This week, you get McCole Hardman stealing those touchdowns, those handoff touchdowns down by the goal line. Hardman with 2 rushing scores. He had only 2 carries previously during the season, but number 1, because it worked, and number 2, because that's really the only thing that Hardman can bring to the table. We probably will see a little bit more of that. For a team to score so many points, it's just very difficult to predict what they're going to do. And so in a start-sit environment, if this is a true redraft team and not a best ball team, it's eternally frustrating. I don't think that we have the answer yet. I thought maybe there was a tiny little possibility that they might make a move for a disgruntled player, maybe a Cam Akers. But it turns out that I don't think malcontent is exactly the right word, but the player with sort of an uncertain background that they do go out and get is Kadarius Toney. Toney probably a little bit more of a medium depth gadget player, if you can call it that, than someone like a Hardman. And yet the addition of Toney probably lowers the ceiling a little bit for these running backs as well. This is moving almost in the direction of a straight Bills type of approach, where the backs are used very situationally and have just a fraction of the fantasy value that a team with this much scoring upside per game, a fraction of what you would expect them to have at the running back position. I don't think any of these guys are playable right now in redraft. In a month, that could be different. Definitely, if you have any of these guys, you can't cut them. There is a scenario where McKinnon goes back to being what he was in the reality playoffs last year, where they just give up kind of on both of these other two guys and say, look, we can call any play we want when McKinnon's in the game. Let's do it that way. The other guy who still could emerge, it's tough when you're a late round draft pick, wasn't a particularly good college player, you're having to mix in with other guys. If you don't get a lot of carries and you make the wrong read or you get tackled in the backfield, you lose a little bit of your confidence, the team goes back away from you, then you have the good week of practice, you're back in the game. These kinds of things can happen for 2 or 3 weeks, for 5 or 6 weeks, and then suddenly they hit and Pacheco becomes the big league winner. I think that you have to look at that as the scenario that you're chasing a little bit, that you're hoping to have happen here. His particular profile is probably not as good for it as a handful of other guys. It's probably not as good for it as a Ronald Jones, but we've gotten to the point here with how poorly these guys have played and how much the Chiefs have stuck with them, even though, there's a mix. You can say they haven't really stuck with any of these guys, but they've stayed the players who are active. I think that believing it's Jones takes a lot of belief, but even he, and especially if you have 20 roster spots or you're a deep dynasty league, continue to maintain exposure to all of the Chiefs backs. The worst thing that can happen here is that you give these guys away and then you don't have the league winner. To say it could be anybody, that's not very actionable, except to say continue to maintain your exposures. You think back to last year, and you made the great point about guys like Rashad Penny, guys who in the main event didn't play a big role because they were locked, because they've been dropped so late in the season that you couldn't then re-add them. It's very easy to see in so many different ways how a Chiefs back could be locked this year and go on and score a ton of points in the fantasy playoffs.
So, Shawn, you're saying there's a chance?
There's a chance.
There's still a chance for Rojo. I have some even 16-team leagues where he's still hanging on to the roster. So we'll see what happens. But I'm not saying it's going to happen, but back to the Penny point of him really not being active through those first 12 weeks of the season last year, and then we get to a situation where he's the absolute league winner hammer down the stretch. And there will be scenarios again this year where that does happen, and there is a possibility it'll be Ronald Jones, but that might just be my imagination running wild yet again here when it comes to Ronald Jones. But that is going to get us to the end of today's episode. This is the third RotoViz Overtime podcast of the week. If you haven't checked out the other ones, make sure you do check them out. The Monday recap shows, which come out at 5 a.m. 5 a.m. Eastern, that is, each and every Monday, have been very, very popular. Check those out. We will be back with another one of those this coming Monday to recap everything that happens in NFL Week 8. If you are a podcast listener on the audio side, please drop us a written review on your favorite podcast app. But if you are listening to this even over on YouTube, please drop us a written review on your favorite podcast app. It does help us out a lot. It only takes a second. Click the subscribe button over there as well. That is going to wrap up today's show. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, good luck in NFL Week 8. Have a good one.